Fall 2019 Agriculture Industry Update webinar. My name is Victor Kruger, and I will again host today's session. I am a Senior Vice President of MMP Ltd, the insolvency and restructuring arm of MMP LLP. For those of you that don't know, MMP is the 5th largest professional services firm in Canada, with offices from coast to coast. MMP believes in having specialized client groups and has identified 15 business niches that have dedicated employees working in them. Agriculture is one of our largest niches and oldest niches, and we are the only professional services firm with a farm management services group comprised of professional agrologists and consultants who come to us from extensive agriculture backgrounds. This group supports our other service lines in any ag-related engagements, and in particular, in every agriculture insolvency or restructuring, we bring in our FMC specialists to provide us with expert advice to a specific situation and, if necessary, to be hands-on in a formal administration. This webinar is not live, but taped and has been sent to you so that you can watch it on your own time rather than when we wanted to present it to you. Please feel free to share this webinar with your colleagues. In the past 6 months, we have seen many issues that affect the agriculture industry. In fact, things can move so fast that between the drafting of this webinar and today, the Chinese have changed their tune about not accepting our pork products. John had to amend his presentation for this at the last moment. As well, we are hearing from our ag niche partners and from financial institution special loans groups that certain areas of the ag industry are experiencing financial stress. This is not only restricted to Canada. In the US, they have seen a 24% increase in farm bankruptcies in the year ended September 30th, 2019 from the previous year. Record high debt coupled with retaliatory tariffs, 2 years of adverse planting, growing, and harvesting conditions, and delays in assistant program payments have contributed to this increase in the US. Today, we have John Lepke as our presenter to explain these issues and what you need to look out for the next little while. John has a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture degree and has spent more than 18 years working with agriculture clients, including 10 years in the ag group of a chartered bank. John still keeps his hand in the industry by working on the family farm as required. John, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Vic. So for today's presentation, we're going to start off just looking at some market fundamentals, talk about a little bit on U.S. foreign exchange, and then run through some highlights of what's happening in some of our major ag commodity groups. So just to start off, when we talk about some of the market fundamentals and what they mean to agriculture commodities in specific, couldn't start without talking about supply demand. Really one of the basis of what we're looking at when we're talking about ag commodities. I always like to say that people have to eat, and that drives the demand side. Typically, demand for ag commodities doesn't vary on a global scale quickly. It's usually a long-term shift. The piece that we always see is the supply side that tends to move more quickly. At the end of the day, there's always an equalization between supply and demand, and that's usually a function of price. We have to obviously talk about the fact that Canada is a large exporter of ag commodities. And as a result of that, we really look at the Canadian ag space from a global perspective. So as much as supply demand does try and equalize itself out, two disruptors that are Usually in play are production, which we already kind of talked about there with supply. And we'll see some examples of that as we go through some of the different commodity groups. And the other one is trade as a big disruptor. And again, we'll see a couple of examples of that as we go through our presentation. In Canada, we also have a supply management system for dairy and poultry products, where we try and more closely match the supply and demand. Given that, producers in this group do tend to focus more on costs and controlling costs, because they don't have as much control over the price of the products that they're selling. And I guess I should say, not that the other commodity groups have control over it, just they've got a little more ability to choose when to sell. And we'll see in supply management, there's a little bit of these commodity groups that are still affected to a lesser degree by trade, but still affected. So here's a great example of how trade sometimes can disrupt commodities. At the top of the slide, we're looking at some canola and looking at Canadian exports through 2 time periods. The 2018-29 crop year versus the 2019-2020 crop year. And we've all heard about some interesting things going on with China and trade. So here's some good examples of what happens as we move through a scenario like that. So if we look at China and look at canola and how much they've taken from Canadian exporters, we see a drastic difference between the 18-19 crop year and this year. So we've seen that reduce quite drastically. And we've seen exports to other countries increase to take up some of that flow. But interestingly, when you look at United Arab Emirates, they really stand out as someone that's increased their buy of Canadian canola quite drastically. And when you dig into it a little bit further, what we realize is that there isn't enough processing capacity to crush all that canola in United Arab Emirates. So the speculation is that they're buying Canadian canola, turning around, selling it to China. So the product still moves to where it needs to go. It's just moving through a different channel. Soybeans is kind of another great example of that, given the trade issues that we're seeing with China. Looking at, going from that 2018-2019 crop year, selling quite a bit of soybeans to China, to this year where it's just dropped off the map and there's nothing, right? And then if we go one line down, looking at Iran, we see the inverse of that, right? Where they bought almost nothing from Canada last year and really ramping things up this year. And again, speculation is that they're likely buying Canadian soybeans, turning around and selling them to China. And when I say that, it's not even that the soybeans physically would move from Canada to Iran and then through to China. A lot of times they still move directly from Canada to China. We always say that maybe they just have a different passport. So a great example of how trade can kind of disrupt that normal supply demand. Also want to just quickly touch on the U.S. foreign exchange. The reason why we kind of highlight this is just there's lots of trade between the countries. A lot of Canadian product does get exported down to the U.S. So that is something, where foreign exchange would be important to look at. And the other thing to realize is that a lot of commodities that your producers in Canada are selling, those prices are based on some sort of U.S. function. So it's always important just to keep in mind what's going on with that foreign exchange between Canada and the U.S. And as we see over the last kind of 12 months, we've seen it go up and down a bit, but for the most part, hasn't really changed to a large degree. So moving on and talking about some more specific trade deals that are happening globally and specifically how they impact Canada. I'm sure most of you are aware that China suspended export licenses on canola for two of our big exporters, Richardson and Viterra. And that's retaliation following the arrest of one of their big CFOs of a Chinese company. So Canada has filed that formal challenge with the WTO. That's going to force China to, provide some scientific evidence, and so we'll see exactly how long it takes to resolve that. China had banned the import of red meat. Again, that was largely just a retaliatory move based on the arrest of that CFO. And just recently, as of this week, we've seen China has lifted that ban, which now makes a lot more pork and beef. Obviously, we're expecting to move to China, and we'll talk about, especially on the pork side, once we get to the pork sector, why that's important. The other thing to note is that we didn't have an ambassador to China here for quite a while, but Dominic Barton has recently been appointed, and hopefully that will help in resolving some of these issues on a more quick basis. So if we look at what's going on the trade side with Canada and some other countries, we've got some issues with wheat and barley moving to Saudi Arabia, just as a backlash by some tweets by our foreign affairs minister a couple of months ago. Italy is trying to keep our durum out of their country just to protect their domestic durum price and help support their local farmers. So they're looking at a country of origin labeling is what that acronym stands for, and trying to keep Canadian product out of their country based off of that. If we're looking at India, specifically peas and lentils, they had been very protectionist up until recently, and we're starting to see them easing up a bit more. But again, just some of these ways that they're looking at protecting their domestic producers. If we look at Vietnam, they're trying to keep some of our wheat out of their country. In this case, it's for phytosanitary reasons. Vietnam historically hasn't had much in the way of thistles, and definitely nothing like we would see in Canada or the US. So they did say they found some thistle seeds in some shipments of wheat, and as a result have just totally banned all wheat coming in from Canada. And interestingly, they just recently did the same with Russia. So remains to be seen if that's for true phytosanitary reasons, or if that's, again, just a protectionist move to keep foreign product out of their country to support their local farmers. And as I mentioned, lots of what happens in the U.S. impacts us here in Canada. So just a brief update on what's going on with U.S. and China. Those negotiations have been going on for some time, as I'm sure you've all read in the news. And we keep hearing about this phase one deal. In the last couple of days, I think we're starting to hear a lot more positive news about phase one from both sides. So it does seem like that's starting to gain more traction. And we could see that at least phase one coming to some sort of agreement before the end of 2019. If that happens, China's agreeing, at least in principle, to purchase a large amount of U.S. egg products. And so if they're buying lots of U.S. egg products, that impacts the price. And as I said, that'll impact the price for Canadian farmers as well. The major stumbling block has been that intellectual property that still hasn't been addressed. It could derail everything, but there does seem to be a lot of optimism that at least on a phase one deal, they can get something worked out. at the end of the day, it does affect interest rates to a certain extent, just because every time there was some sort of news regarding the trade deal, whether positive or negative, it impacted the outlook for the general economy down in the U.S., which then impacted the interest rate environment. So as I kind of mentioned, the ripple effect for Canadian farmers is going to be in commodity prices. Lots of the commodity prices are based on some U.S. price. And so if the U.S. price changes, that flows back into Canada and affects our price here as well. Another recent trade deal that's been finalized is between U.S. and Japan. At the time when CPTPP was being signed, U.S. backed out of it and felt that they could make a better deal just on an individual basis with some of these countries. And so we've seen them finalize something now with Japan. And it looks like it gives them a lot of the benefits that they would have got with CPTPP. So it's important for the U.S. industry on the agriculture side, mainly in the pork and the poultry tariffs. Those are going to be eliminated over time. And as we see lots of pork flowing from Canada into the U.S., that's going to be important for our Canadian producers. And then also it opens up the market for wheat and barley as well. So moving on, talking about our first commodity group here, which is poultry. I think in general, the outlook for poultry remains, fairly good, fairly steady. As I'll show you in the next slide, lots of increasing consumer demand. I'd say it's probably the meat of choice for Canadians, if I can say that. So due to that, prices and of course consumption are continue to improve. One thing that is impacting the industry, and it's nothing really new, but continues to be there, is just the new standard for cages. If you're looking at a layer operation, they now have a higher standard for the cages. So that's going to increase the cost for any producers that are building new or looking at retrofitting or renovating their barns. So just something to keep in mind. Haven't touched on USMCA yet. And so that trade deal kind of is still in limbo. Doesn't look like there's a lot of motivation on the U.S. side to get it signed from certain parties. So that seems to be a roadblock. They seem to be interested more in talking about impeachment these days rather than signing a new trade deal. So if that deal does go through, there is some impacts for the poultry industry. It's going to open up the market a bit for more U.S. product to come in. And because of that, the Canadian government's agreed to compensate them, although we haven't heard details around what that compensation actually is going to look like. And in a few slides here, I'll just touch on what a non-supply managed industry on the poultry side looks like, and just give you an update on what Costco has been up to down in the U.S. So as I mentioned, there's been good demand for poultry products in general in Canada. As you can see from the graph, chicken and eggs are on an upward trend there with per capita disappearance increasing over the last 10 years. We don't see that kind of slowing down. It seems like everything that we're looking at shows that trend continuing to increase. Pork and beef have been a bit on the decline and seem to be leveling off or increasing a little bit. So I'd say demand seems to be relatively stable for those. The only one that's, I guess, a little bit on the decline when we're talking about poultry is turkey. Again, on a very long trend line there, it does seem to be decreasing a bit. And I know the industry's looking at ways of just getting consumers to purchase turkey differently. In the past and today, I guess, largely turkey sales have been, whole turkeys. And consumer preference is not to buy that much product all at once. So I think a key for the turkey industry is just figuring out a way of selling turkey to consumers based on their preference, which is in smaller amounts. So I mentioned Costco before. Interestingly, Costco in the U.S., not in Canada, but in the U.S., has announced a new chicken plant that's going to supply all of their rotisserie chicken for the U.S. So just to put some numbers around what that actually means, they're selling upwards of 91 million rotisserie chickens every year in the U.S. And so they're really looking to become more vertically integrated by setting up their own processing plant for chickens. What they've been finding is that, the U.S. poultry industry really controlled by, a couple of large suppliers, which I listed there, and they control over 60% of the poultry market. And so they've been, like most companies, trying to increase profits, and that means charging more for their chickens. And Costco just feels that they can do a better job or bring that in-house, and they feel comfortable bringing that section of the market within Costco and try and do that on their own. So interesting just to see the difference between, a supply managed type industry here in Canada versus what a non-supply managed industry down in the U.S. is doing. Moving on to dairy, I think we're seeing the demand for milk and butter fat continuing to increase. Fluid milk actually is on the decline, but industrial milk, if we can call it that, is on the increase. Industrial being your cheeses, your butters, your yogurts, your ice cream. Canadians seem to be preferring to eat more and more of those types of products, less and less on the fluid side. What that means is quota holdings, I think we're going to see them going up in the last 6 months. They've kind of stabled off to a certain degree. But I think as a general trend, we're going to see more quota being issued here in the near future as more Canadians are eating those cheeses, butters, yogurts, those types of products. What's happening, those margins are starting to tighten up on the dairy side, as I'll show you in the next slide. Another trend that we're seeing is consolidation. That's not limited necessarily to dairy, but I've got just some stats that I can show you regarding how quickly the dairy industry is consolidating. Not much of an update on the USMCA and the trade side. Similar to poultry, the trade deal kind of seems to be not a priority at this point for the U.S. side. So we're taking a wait and see approach to see what's going on there. As we look at the U.S. dairies, we did see a lot more insolvencies and bankruptcies down in the U.S. on the dairy side. Their milk prices have been depressed for quite a few years. Recently, they have rebounded, and so we're seeing some very strong dairy prices on the world market. But they did go through a really big downturn there, and as a result of that, we saw lots of small dairy farms not survive and exit the industry. So, yeah, interesting just to see what that impact is, especially on those smaller dairies that probably did not have, the large level of working capital that would have been needed to survive that prolonged of a downturn. So looking at dairies here, we're seeing cost of production for the industry kind of rose by about 5.1% in 2018. And every year, the Canadian Dairy Commission adjusts prices based off of cost of production and also the consumer pricing index. but didn't raise prices enough to kind of match that increase in cost. So revenues are only expected to increase by about 4.1% as a result. So when I say margins are tightening, it's not a drastic tightening, but that is the trend, and we definitely see that continuing. Given what's going on with some parts of the country and feed production, we are expecting that cost of production to rise again going forward. I think definitely the hay, the silage, some of those feed areas are going to be tough to find, and we're seeing some really high prices for lots of those types of products. Feed grain prices, I think we're going to see come down, but I don't think that's going to offset the high cost of feed for dairy farmers. So I talked about consolidation a bit before, and so here's just a slide illustrating a little bit of what's been happening in the dairy industry. On the left, we see the number of farms obviously has been decreasing over the past couple of years, and with that, we've seen the number of cows also been decreasing. So the dairy herd is shrinking, but interestingly, if you look at the right slide, we're actually seeing production going up during that same time frame quite a bit. So really speaks to the efficiencies that guys are experiencing in the dairy industry, and how they're able to produce more liters of milk with less cows. So again, it's what the industry needs to do just to remain, I guess, in a profitable scenario for guys. Just having to produce more with less cows and become more efficient. So that really is the trend that we're seeing in dairy, is guys are needing to become more efficient as we move forward. So interesting just to see that trend and that consolidation as we go through. So moving on to crops. Obviously, lots to talk about in this sector. I'll take a look just briefly at some of the long-term pricing that we're expecting. Then look at production and harvest and what's been going on from that perspective, and then touch just quickly on what's happening on some farm equipment. So I showed this slide last time, but I think it bears, or it's worth repeating. On the right-hand side, we kind of look at world production, and we see that increasing, and we expect those lines to continue to increase as we're going forward here. And on the left-hand side, we see production going down. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to start this slide again. So just talking about where we're seeing long-term prices going. On the right-hand side, we're looking at world crop production, and we're seeing production increasing year over year. We don't expect that to change, given just what's going on in the industry. We expect that production is going to continue to ramp up, especially on a global scale. And as I mentioned earlier, demand is kind of slow to move, and so we think that supply is going to outstrip demand, and as a result, on the left-hand side, we're expecting those real crop prices to go down. USDA just updated, I guess, their estimates, and really the update just confirms this slide that they expect crop production to continue to increase and outstrip demand. As an example of this, in Australia, we're seeing about a 30% reduction in the Australian wheat crop. So quite a large reduction with zero impact on wheat prices, right? The rest of the world's had increased wheat production to kind of overcome that. So on a global basis, we haven't really seen that much of a difference on the wheat production. And as a result, prices are really not affected by the shortage of production on the Australian side. Looking at some harvest and what's going on here in Canada, we kind of had an early and a fast start to harvest, I'll call it, for a lot of the prairies, maybe a little more normal for Saskatchewan and a bit delayed for Alberta. And then weather just became a huge hindrance through September and moving through into October as well. Lots of rain just continued to fall at record levels. So I think we're going to see quality being a bit of an issue, especially when we're in Alberta and parts of Saskatchewan. So farm revenues as a result are likely going to be impacted. To what degree, we're not quite sure what. And it's obviously going to impact working capital as a result. I always use the analogy that crop farming, it's almost like riding a merry-go-round. And every year your working capital kind of buys you that ticket to buy your crop inputs and ride that merry-go-round one more year. So we'll see if guys have enough working capital to go ahead and buy those crop inputs and buy that ticket to go on the merry-go-round. If they're in a scenario where they don't, I guess we can expect them to reach out to their lenders, look at leveraging some of their longer-term assets. And likely with the increase we've seen in land prices over the last couple of years, most guys should have some capability to do that. So we'll see. It remains to be seen kind of what the impact is going to be, but definitely as a general trend, probably less working capital for most grain farmers this year. Grain movement, though, has been really good so far. Previous years, we've seen some issues with moving grain, but this year hasn't been that. I think the rail lines have worked out some of their issues, and so we're seeing better service from them. We have seen, I guess, a bit better than expected yields in light of the fact that it started off quite dry in the spring. So those drought conditions, everyone had some more negative outlooks for growing conditions in the spring. As we move through the summer, got some timely rains in certain parts of the country anyways. And so that's helped boost up where we think yields are going to be. And I just kind of listed off where Western Canada harvest progress is. And so obviously delayed quite a bit from where we are normally. Just looking at where we estimate some production to be for Canada, looking at probably the smallest soybean production in about 4 years. And largely that's because of acres being reduced. Hasn't been a great environment to be growing soybeans the last couple of years in Canada. So canola, on the other hand, seems to be probably one of I think our second largest is what StatsCan is expecting. It is down from last year. That's a combination of, lower number of acres being planted to canola in combination with, as I mentioned, some of those drought conditions. Wheat, on the other hand, we're seeing a slight increase as what kind of the prediction is. Again, lots more guys planted wheat this year, but it's offset to a certain degree by the drought. Just taking a quick look at the U.S. Harvest just really has a long way to go down the U.S. still. As I talked about in the springtime there, late seeding due to some major flooding in certain areas and some really saturated fields. Now the question is, can they get it harvested? Snow and rain are making it really difficult in certain parts of the country. The forecast kind of is for lower yields for corn and soybeans as a result. But I think a little bit like Canada, everyone's a little bit surprised that as we're going through harvest, the yields aren't as bad as everyone kind of thought they might have been. So remains to be seen where the numbers finally land, but I think some guys are optimistic that it'll be slightly better than perhaps what we thought a month or two ago. Just looking at machinery purchases, they're kind of still trending downward over time here. Four-wheel drive tractors are significantly down. Smaller tractors, under 100 horsepower tractors down. Combine sales are also really down. I think part of it is we saw a surge in buying before some of the steel tariffs came in. So that kind of preempted some guys to go out and buy if they were anywhere close to thinking about buying. But I think now that we're going through some tougher harvest conditions, farmer confidence is also a bit on the lower side. So we're going to see less sales probably continue as we go through to next year. We've been hearing that a lot of the major manufacturers aren't producing equipment on spec. So you've got to go out and order them, make a down payment, and then they'll build it for you over the next couple of months. So manufacturers just really aren't willing to take the risk and don't feel that there's a lot of confidence from farmers to go out and purchase new equipment. Interestingly, John Deere announced a little while ago that they're laying off some of their staff down in the U.S. on the production manufacturing side. It was related more to construction equipment, but still kind of looks at where John Deere's headspace is at, and they're definitely not seeing it as good rosy times for equipment manufacturing in general. Moving on to hogs, I think we're looking at probably a profitable year for most guys on the hog side. As I mentioned, prices are based in the U.S., and so as the U.S. market has had some access for China, those prices have been fairly stable from that perspective. And so we're projecting a pretty good year for hog guys. Feed costs are another factor, given probably lots of feed grade wheat and probably good supply of barley. I think we're going to see feed costs coming down for hog guys. We'll talk a little bit about trade in a few slides and definitely look at some disease pressure that we're seeing, which also kind of ties into trade. So as I mentioned, here's kind of a little bit of where we're expecting hog profit for most guys across Canada to look like. So that trend is continuing upwards as we're seeing prices pretty stable. So just an interesting slide I thought I'd throw in there while we're talking about trade. When we're looking at pork exports and looking year over year where the Canadian pork is going, we saw an increase for Japan, and that's largely due to that new trade deal that we signed with Japan that came into effect earlier in the year. So we're already seeing immediate impact from that. A lot of times when we see these trade deals get signed, it takes a long time for the impact to actually show up. But with pork and that Japan trade deal, we're seeing that happen quite a bit quicker. The other piece is China, the third line down there. And so we saw a big surge in sales to China, and we'll talk about why just in a few slides when we talk about some of the disease. And that kind of stabled or tapered off for the last couple of months after they banned the pork exports from Canada. And as Victor kind of mentioned, now recently we're seeing that trade barrier being lifted. And so I think for the remainder of probably December and into November here, we're going to see the exports increasing. Now, interestingly, one of the bottlenecks when we're moving that much pork over to China just is logistics. So it kind of remains to be seen how much we can actually get into China. There's only so much port space, so only so many ships can kind of get the product over there. They can only unload so fast, and then from there it actually has to get put on rail or trucks and move throughout the country. So the logistical side isn't set up to handle that much pork coming in through China. So we're waiting to see where some of those bottlenecks are from that standpoint. Looking at some diseases that are affecting the hog industry, PD obviously has been around in Canada here for a little bit, and specifically looking at Manitoba, we saw, the disease kind of ramp up, Ontario, Manitoba, a little bit in Alberta, and then kind of taper off. Last year, we only saw about 17 cases in 2018, and then in Manitoba this last year, they kind of ramped back up, and we saw 78. So producers and industry professionals still trying to figure out what causes this disease to spread. And just biosecurity continues to be just a real key factor for guys to focus on. The other big one, and I mentioned it in springtime, is African swine fever. It's a much more virulent disease, almost 100% fatality for all hog ages. And we're just seeing it really go through Southeast Asia. It's really impacted the Chinese and spread outside of the Chinese borders as well. And I think we're going to see some long-lasting effects that are happening from that. So, now that it's kind of spread outside of China, the chances of it spreading to North America, I guess, are just going up. And that's getting everyone in the industry fairly nervous. And also with that, really stepping up efforts to try and keep it out of our country, both US and Canada. I think there's experts out there that would probably admit that it's in the US and Canada, but likely at an airport somewhere. Just hasn't made it into a domestic hog population just yet. So just looking at China here, just showing all the different cases of African swine fever, and it's really ravaged that country's pork industry. And then over the last couple of months, it's spread beyond the borders and is affecting all sorts of other countries, Thailand, Vietnam, some of those countries are really being heavily impacted by it as well. So how big is the impact? Just taking a look at it, China's total pork production in 2018 was about 54 million metric ton. That is about half of the world's pork production. So it's a huge country that consumes a lot of pork. With the introduction of African swine fever, on a conservative estimate, we're thinking it's about 25% production decrease. So that translates into about 13.5 million metric ton that they're going to be short, assuming that demand stays the same, which we don't see that it's going to be changing. So there's kind of a 13.5 million ton shortfall of protein. So that, if we look at it from a global scale, that is about 12% of the world pork production, which is a huge amount. And, so assuming the Chinese can't get enough pork, they're probably going to be looking at potentially chicken for their protein. So that 13.5 million ton represents about 6.5% of the world pork and chicken production. So it's on a huge scale that we're seeing this disease affecting the hog industry. So I think we thought it was going to affect the pork supply a bit sooner. But I think what no one quite realized, and it's always hard to get information out of China, is that they had some massive frozen storage of pork happening in their country. So they had like mile-long freezer containers that they've been eating through over the last couple of months as their pork supply domestically has been reduced. So I think they've eaten through that now, and that's a little bit of why China has lifted that ban on pork and beef, because they're really looking for the product, and they can't really, get into a trade war necessarily when their food supply is in that short of a supply. So, well, it'll be interesting to see exactly what's going on next for the hog industry. Moving on to the beef side, looking at the cow-calf industry, I think, it's fairly stable in Canada. As I'll show on the next slide, herd growth is kind of plateaued. We had a bit of a slow start here to the fall run, but there's kind of ample forage and feed grains out there in certain parts of the country. So I think guys are not terribly anxious to get their calves off. More guys are looking at backgrounding and waiting for prices to go up. Talking about consumer preferences, beef has been in the news a lot recently. It's good for the environment. It's bad for the environment. So it's interesting just how consumer preferences really are changing and seem to be changing on a fairly rapid basis. So as a result of that, we're seeing more of these alternative proteins coming into the market. And just a comment on consumer preferences continue to change, especially when it's coming to the beef side. So just showing kind of the trend here. Cattle inventory seems to be remaining fairly stable, maybe declining just a touch, but doesn't seem to be any huge changes as we're going through 2019 here. Moving on to feedlots, we saw some higher prices due to that kill plant fire that happened down in the U.S. It was a Tyson plant down in Kansas City. It represented about 5% of the U.S. slaughter. So a big amount all of a sudden got shut down. And so you would have thought that if all of a sudden, there's less demand from a feedlot level because they can't move their product to the kill plant. What actually happened was there was a shortage of beef because the plant was so big. So grocery stores couldn't get enough beef in. So that caused prices to actually go up. In Canada here, I think we're seeing pen space at a premium. We've got some cheap feed that's coming into the market. So it looks like guys have the ability to make some money here based off of that. And risk management obviously is still key for these guys. Still have to, have a good foreign exchange hedge program in place. Look at your feed prices and how you're managing your risk from that perspective. So even though it looks like there's some opportunity to make some money here, still have to be on top of your risk management strategies. Moving on to wineries. Nothing new necessarily, but I think growing just as the concept of agritourism. As wineries are looking to diversify some of their income streams, agritourism is a big one. And so they're looking at just ways of getting different revenue streams from the kind of their same asset. So some of obviously the larger wineries have some big tourism dollars coming in through there. And part of it also is building their brand. Definitely a very important part, especially for Canadian wines, is branding and just building from there. I think demand for quality vineyard property is still pretty strong. Guys are looking at controlling that productive asset over a long term versus maybe going out and buying someone else's brand. So, we are expecting, I think, a bit of a lighter crop as some growers have reduced their grape loads. They were anticipating I call it a more difficult ripening season. And as we went through harvest, those concerns were kind of realized as the weather's been colder and wetter than normal. So The other obviously big factor for wineries in Canada is exports. And on the next slide, I'll just kind of highlight a little bit of what's going on with exports in Canada. So just kind of highlights over the last couple of years where Canadian wines have been exported. Obviously, number one is China, although that's been decreasing a little bit year over year. But US has kind of picked that up and is surging on exports from Canada. So, I think premium brand and premium quality is what Canada is known for globally. And it's just important that they continue, I guess, branding that out to the global market. Moving on to cannabis, obviously lots in the news lately. I think we're seeing some sluggish retail sales, maybe sales not as high as some were expecting. That's led to some challenges just on some valuations. I think people have realized there's not an unlimited source of capital out there for cannabis. So, we're seeing some market share prices coming down on some of these companies. Not unrealistic to kind of expect that we're going to see some consolidation or potentially even failure for some of these companies as we're looking at ways to survive. It definitely is becoming more of a commodity and not so much of a niche. So cost of production is key, and keeping that as low as possible is really going to be important for some of these companies going forward. I think, on the supply side, they kind of have that figured out. The next sort of, I'll call it 1.0 to 2.0 is going to be on the edible side. And so that's kind of the new opportunity, looking at some different market segments. Not really going to, be a huge windfall, but these companies do need to find their niches and figure out their value proposition a bit. So, we're seeing on the joint venture side, example is Anheuser-Busch partnering, trying to get a cannabis related product out there on the market. So it'll be interesting just to see what the innovative ways are that they're coming up with. The industry trying to figure out where they're going to go next. On the food and beverage side, margins are getting tighter and tighter every day. That's kind of a continuing trend. Companies are looking at specifically lowering costs by lowering energy, water, waste, just becoming more efficient. Food safety is also obviously a big one. Kind of goes back to branding a bit in that no one wants to be tagged with having a food safety violation. It's a long-lasting black mark and takes a long time to recover from. So that's probably a big fear for lots of the food and beverage companies out there. I think export is probably the big opportunity for these companies, especially if we're looking down at the US. We have that advantage of that foreign exchange, so that definitely helps us to be more competitive versus a potential US company. The other factor that's impacting the food and beverage industry on a whole is access to labor. It's tough to find labor in these industries. As a result, we're seeing more and more companies moving to automation. And to kind of combat that, as a result, you still need labor, but fewer labor and just different qualifications. They're looking more for skilled labor that can work with the automation programmers, that type of thing. So, interesting just to see how that's going to play out over the next while here. That's all I had. Back to you, Victor.
Thank you, John, for your very informative presentation. As always, we'd like to thank everyone for their participation in this webinar, and we would encourage you to contact John or any of our farm management consulting practitioners directly with any specific agricultural questions you may have, or contact me regarding any insolvency issues. John and my contact information is here on the screen for you and is included as part of the presentation material. The appendix to today's presentation also includes further information about MMP and our Farm Management Consulting Group. We look forward to your participation at our Spring 2020 webinar. And I know it's early, but on behalf of all of us at MMP, I would like to wish everyone a great holiday season and a wonderful 2020. This session is now concluded.